Does a CVSS score of 9.8 always mean patch now? Hey, Manny, I know, this past, I guess, month or so here, everybody was losing their minds over the recent Log4j exploit that was announced, and a lot of people had to work over the holidays as well as a result of that. So it sounds like you have a story about that and maybe some best practices on how to go about remediation. Yeah, thanks, John. So, the story that I chose, and I believe that we did a story on Log4j when it first came out in late November, and I think we did a story in sometime in December on this. So as you said, there was a lot going on with Log4j. I think everybody, anybody who's in this field, knows what Log4j is and what it meant to most people in this field, which was usually working over the holidays, working into the weekends to go figure out where this stuff was. So just to take folks back who perhaps didn't see what was going on or didn't see the story last month. So back in late November, the Apache Java-based logging utility, the Log4j, there was a vulnerability that was announced, and when it was announced, obviously, it was a pretty big one because unfortunately, this logging utility is another one of those things that is embedded in places where perhaps folks didn't realize it was embedded, and so the first task was sort of going to figure out, where is this actually installed? Do I have it running? And where is it actually installed? Because it's very easy to just say, no, I don't have that. But it, unfortunately, because of its nature of running and being able to be embedded into other like applications, there were a lot of questions that came out in the beginning as to, am I actually vulnerable to this or not, right? So back in early December, there was, once this was announced, like any other vulnerability at this scale, there was massive amounts of scanning that was being done. So we saw huge amounts of scanning that were happening, and as everyone knows, this went through multiple iterations. So I'll get into why that sort of has a bearing on this story that I'm trying to talk about, which isn't actually about the Log4j, but just to give folks a little bit of background on it. But there were multiple rounds of patching that happened. So there were multiple versions that came out, and with each version, there were additional vulnerabilities that came out with those newer versions. So people had to go through multiple iterations of this. And then, as this progresses, like we see with any of these things, it starts to morph and to change. And I even saw a story out there about now Mirai actually using a version of the Log4j exploit as part of its payloads. So on top of everything that was happening from a Log4j perspective, that was in December, like throughout December, it's still going on today in terms of the patching efforts. We also had in the beginning of December, and I'm not sure if we've covered this story or not, but in the beginning of December, we have the normal Patch Tuesday that Microsoft does. And unfortunately, there was a problem with the Patch Tuesday for January that caused a whole bunch of issues. So the patch that went out had some potential impacts with VPNs, with domain controllers, with VMs, and specifically some removable media mounting issues. And you can, as you can clearly understand from a server perspective, mounting issues with media is a major problem, right? And I'd read some stories about people having to, lost basically external drives that were attached to servers, which could cause a massive nightmare for folks. So Microsoft ended up pushing out an out of band update before that Microsoft Patch Tuesday. And then there was some additional problems with the out of band because because it was, in order to push the out of band, you had to push out the regular updates. So if you hadn't pushed out the updates, you potentially were pushing out an update that you knew was going to break something before you could push the out of band update. So again, big, huge problems. But to take this all down to where what I want to talk about, which is the whole notion of actually remediating vulnerabilities, right? And from a perspective of the person or the people or the team that are responsible for pushing these patches out to your environment. And the first and foremost is deciding which one of these things, because as we know on this show, because we talk about them pretty much on every single week, is which ones matter to me and which one should I be pushing out, and which one should I prioritize to push out first versus others. So we talk about the CVSS score, which is the common vulnerability scoring system that they implemented with all of the CVEs that go out. The problem with the CVSS score is that it is subjective, meaning that if you asked me the question, if you showed me an exploit and I showed John you that same exact exploit, and I told you to rate it on a scale of 1 to 10 of where that exploit was, I can guarantee you that you and I would not come up with the same number, right? And so it's very subjective, right? And I get that there's probably it's the CVSS score is not based on two people's opinion, but it's still a subjective score. And that score, unfortunately, when you bring it into an environment, it becomes even more subjective, meaning that the people have to look at it and decide between the severity and the risk, right? So there's a severity because the CVSS score is basically based on the severity of the actual exploit or whatever the vulnerability actually is, right? So there's a severity. But the risk, unfortunately, the risk is something that each individual that's looking at this has to decide on their own, right? Like, do I have that running in my environment? Is that something that is internet facing based on this particular vulnerability? Is this something, again, like all of those things have to be taken into consideration when you're looking at one of these things. So as these things are being produced and they're being publicized, even if something comes out and they say, hey, this has got a CVSS score of 9.8, everybody doesn't need to jump in and start to patch for something that's 9.8 because you have to take all these things into consideration, right? Like, is this actually running in my environment, right? And is this something that I can push off because there's something else that's been pushed out? Because usually these things come out, as everyone knows, these things come out in multiples, meaning there's usually not a single vulnerability that's released. It usually comes out in packs of vulnerabilities. So you have to decide amongst all of them, especially if you're in a larger environment, you have to decide, hey, does this particular vulnerability affect me more, and do I have to actually patch for this one before I send the troops off to go patch for this other one, which may be buried deeper in my environment, or perhaps even I have to go figure out whether it's actually in my environment, right? So all of these things that have to be taken into consideration when I'm actually, deciding on the prioritization of remediating these things inside of my environment. So I'll kind of pause there, John, to see if you've got any comments on that. But I think there's an issue there. I think that that probably requires some discussion of how the best way is to go about doing that.
Right. I totally agree. And it really comes, in my mind with a lot of these vulnerabilities is it does need to kind of get triaged in a way. Just like when somebody goes to the emergency room, they take a look at what is this vulnerability? And like you said, well, do I actually have this in my environment? So having like really good asset inventory and application inventory of what you know to be true about your environment is really going to be critical in determining, what is our risk exposure to this vulnerability, and whether we need to, get on top of this right away. So, I think there's a lot of, it's more than just having the score itself. Yeah, the score can be bad, maybe a vulnerability comes out for some weird, let's say some weird protocol for a car or something, an automobile, right?
Yep.
If you're not in that business and it's a 9.8, if you're not in that business and you don't have that, you don't use that protocol, then it doesn't mean anything to you. But things like, like you said, it really comes down to whether or not you actually have this in your enterprise. The one thing I would say about Log4j that made it exceptionally difficult is that it's kind of bundled in with Java, and you may or may not know whether your application is actually using it. And so it's kind of hard to determine very quickly how many people are actually using it, even though it's deployed as part of their Java build that they have. They might not actually use Log4j to do their logging mechanism, so it might not actually come into play, even though it's in their, the Java build that they're using to execute,
Right.
maybe their Tomcat installation or whatever.
Yeah, no, I mean, really, there's, that's really the key of it. I mean, I'm not sure if I have too much more to go into it, but really much to talk about in terms of like, if I'm a security professional and I'm in that position where I have to go and make that decision about like I'm getting these scores, or and look, there's a lot of companies out there that perhaps don't have the advantage of having, let's say, a team that is dedicated to looking for these things, right? Dedicated for like a vulnerability management team, right? That's their sole job. Perhaps you have, like an admin who just has to like look at this stuff and decide, hey, like, is this something that I have to be worried about? And do I have to go patch for this stuff? And so like you have to take into consideration, again, some of the things that they talk about is like worst case scenario. So you got to read that. You got to read the vulnerability and start thinking about worst case scenario. Like, what's the worst case scenario when I read through this about what could happen in my particular environment? Going on the notion that you read something and you go, okay, I've got that running in my environment. But what's worst case scenario here, right? Like, can it be exploited remotely? Is it unauthenticated, right? Like, are those things that you have to take into consideration when I start to try to triage which ones do I handle first? Which ones can I put off later? Because we know also that one of the major problems with patching is the difficulty in patching, right? The notion itself of doing patching, right? A lot of times patching isn't easy, right? We talk about patching just like, hey, look, vendor came out with this patch, just go apply it. It's like, well, no, it's not that easy, right? Like sometimes patching requires me to take things down. And in certain instances, taking applications or servers down is a major thing. Like you have to do it. You have to figure out what your maintenance window is to take this down. Maybe it's an application that really, can't go down for any length of time, right? There's some impact, whether it's impact to customers, impact to revenue, whatever it may be. There's some considerations that have to be taken into in terms of like, what does that mean to me? What kind of impact is that going to have to me if I have to actually take this down? And that plays into like when I decide, right? Like if I know that that's going to impact me, I might be like, okay, well, maybe I can just wait. This came out on Monday. Maybe I can wait until Friday, right? Because Friday is my maintenance window, and then I can take it down perhaps into the weekend, and that's okay. But do you want it sitting vulnerable from Monday through Friday? That's right.
I just want to clarify. We're not suggesting to anybody with the Log4j vulnerability to wait a week to patch.
Right. Yeah.
Because at least from my perspective, unless you have no Java whatsoever in your environment, and that, like 100%, I'm not using Java. Maybe I'm a small business and like a law firm or something, and all I got are Windows machines. And none of those are running applications that are Java, then you're probably not exposed in any way. So I agree. There's a lot to factor in, and the larger your enterprise and organization is, the more difficult it can become to really understand, what your risk exposure is to any specific vulnerability. But I do think having really good asset inventory, having the ability to scan those assets, both, from like a network scanning perspective, as well as having some sort of endpoint type thing that, or like an agent that runs on them, where I can, instrument some sort of scan that's going to maybe look on my entire system for every jar file and find if there's a log4j class file inside that jar file. That's something I would want to have the ability to do as a security responder and system administrator, to be able to discover whether or not, maybe I'm not vulnerable, but I would like to know how, like, have some tooling that I can kind of do this in mass, especially when I have a large enterprise. So I can find out really quickly. And, that might inform your decision too, of what your risk exposure is, being able to quickly look through your entire platform for how much Java you have deployed, and if log4j is there, will inform whether or not you determine this to be, a risky proposition for you to wait, and how long you could wait before you do patch. So.
Yep. I totally agree. I mean, and I think, one of the things, and maybe the last thing I'll say on this is, we've been talking about this probably with the notion that I'm talking about, CVSS scores of 9.0 or greater, right? Because 9.0 or greater, like, most people who look at that can just say, oh, on a scale of 1 to 10, 9.0, that's something I need to pay attention to, right? Like, I absolutely have to go in there and I got to go read it and I got to go figure out if I have it, if I need to patch for it. But what about a CVSS score of 5.0, right? Because I can guarantee you that there are vulnerabilities out there with CVSS scores of 5.0 that if you have that in your environment, I'm going to say that that's probably just as risky as somebody else who's looking at a 9 point something, and it's just as, the risk level is the same height, is the same level as that 5.0, because, you're running it and you realize, like, hey, I'm running that, and those boxes are sitting out on the internet, like they're internet accessible. Right. So for me, that 5.0, I got to pay attention to that too. So that's another thing that I think makes it difficult, is that, you can't just use that score and just say, well, I'm only going to look at the stuff that's all the way over here on the right-hand side of that score. Like, you got to look at everything, and everything's got to be looked at again.
Right. Factor it all together to figure out, like I said, triage it so you understand what does this mean to me? If I have some of this in my enterprise, what is it exposed to the internet? And to what degree is it deployed in my customer base? Maybe I supply this as a device to customers. That might change, completely how I want to, So really, there's a lot of factors that, your security team would need to, factor in when they make a decision of their own. Like, maybe we need to come up with another score. The CVSS score is a plugin into your own scoring system for your own company, of like how risky you think a particular vulnerability is to your larger enterprise.
Yeah, and I think they do have those systems. I think I read it in this, and I forget what it was called. I want to say it was like a PVSS or PVSS score or something. There's something that can be used, and it's a tool that you would basically use internally to answer some questions to help you to figure out where that CVSS score actually how you should be reading that, right? So I think there are some stuff, and there's some tools out there. But one of the other things that I guess I'll leave everyone off with is, again, as suggestion, is make sure that you also have something that you're subscribed to in terms of a vetted InfoSec community, right? Because a lot of times what you need to do is get in touch with other folks who are in similar situations to figure out how they're running how they're looking at this, how they're deciding, how they're figuring out where it is in their environment. So, being attached to again, vetted, right? Because as you said in the earlier story, you don't want to be fooled into what kind of patches you're pushing out there, right? So these communities will kind of push you in the right directions to tell you where the actual patch is, and try to not let you go wrong because it's a larger community trying to solve this a single problem. So
right. Other like-minded groups of actual defenders trying to protect their own businesses and companies.
Yep.
And I know I participate in a bunch of those where we'll chatter about various vulnerabilities in order to better understand it. Sometimes they'll share proof of concept code if somebody gets it, so that you can at least test and understand how this exploit would work. Not so that you could take over other people's systems, but so that you can determine if you're vulnerable and help patch and protect your own system. So there are definitely a lot of InfoSec communities around that type of that kind of structure. So yeah, I agree.